that people can interact with. And these, again, are from 3x5 cards and 5x7 cards that are almost 20 years old, that we drew these little diagrams on as we tried to, take our brains through how are we going to organize this, and then when we get to the sub-pieces, how are we going to organize them. Now, you may notice that these don't necessarily look like the way the park actually turned out, is because there are many, many of these cards. Anything that we work on, it doesn't go in a straight line. It can't go in a straight line, because you really don't know the conclusion. You only know the goal. So every day presents you with these branching choices in design, and you're constantly steering and branching and steering and branching as you find your way towards which of the potential goals will actually be the goal we can reach when we get to the outer end of this process. In a way, it resembles a tree where you start out at the root, you start out where the tree touches the ground, and you know you're going to end up on one leaf of this tree by the time you're done, but you do not know which leaf. So you just start traveling up this tree of ideas, and constantly you're meeting opportunities, challenges, changes, and you find your way out. So these diagrams sometimes don't look like what ended up getting built, but they represent the way we thought about how to build it, so that by the time it was done, we would be confident that there would be strong anchored ideas beneath what otherwise are kind of weirdly disparate elements. I mean, there's nothing that necessarily pulls these things together emotionally so that they make sense as a story, not just as a place, like logically, sure, I can logically go to Africa, but which Africa? There's so many versions of Africa. We want an Africa that's going to tell us a story about a very particular thing. In fact, we want it to be a story about a challenge to the beauty and the wonder and the intrinsic value of the natural land of Africa. So that tells us if Africa, the Africa we're going out into, is supposed to be this beautiful natural place, to make that place appear more beautiful and natural, the village that you depart from should not be that. So where in Africa can we go to find inspiration from a style of architecture that is authentic, that is African, but does not mimic the feeling of nature that we want to have when we go out into nature? And so that led us to the Swahili architecture of the east coast of Africa that indeed became the inspiration for Harambe. It is true that this is a real form of architecture that really exists along the east coast of Africa, but that's not why we chose it. We chose it because the geometry and the hardness and the whiteness and the cubic quality of that architecture sets it apart from this world of nature that we're going to go into, and will make that world appear more natural when we go out into it, because after all, it's not natural. It's a giant machine that we're building for keeping animals alive and moving thousands and thousands of people an hour in vehicles through, so it's got to feel like nature, not just look like nature, feel like nature. And part of the way we're going to do that is by managing the emotional sequence at the beginning. So if you feel the naturalness of that, then you're going to feel the threat all the more, which is of course a threat to harvest out the value of that nature, turn it from intrinsic value into monetary value. And therein lies the conflict that is at the source of almost every story at Animal Kingdom, a conflict between monetary, material value and the intrinsic value of nature. Even Expedition Everest plays out this story through its plotline. So that makes it sound like, oh, we thought this up, and we followed the diagram, and we came up with this idea, and it all worked out very neatly. But of course, as I said before, that's never how it really happens. It's sort of like being blindfolded with a stick and sent off into the woods, and you sort of beat and whack your way through the woods until you get to the other side. So what follows, remember, we already know we've got this park about love of animals, intrinsic value of nature. We know that we want to bring people into this park in some way that is different than the way they've gotten into the other parks, which are about human stories and which are very architectural environments. And what follows is a series of renderings of various explorations of how we might do that. There was the art version, where we thought, well, we're trying to save the planet, like Noah, what if it was like an ark? And we thought, but we will never make it 2 steps down the racetrack with this idea before we're up to our hips in controversy. So, go on. So then we thought of this idea, okay, it's like a garden architectural environment, and it's got sculptures of all these animals, and they're marching their way into the park like they've come to the park as if it was like an ark, and they're all marching in from everywhere, and we march in with these animals, and they're all around us, and they're all headed into the park. And then we thought, okay, so that means when I come to the park, and I look at my first view, and I take a photograph of my view, I'm looking at hundreds of animals' butts. Okay, so it's not that, that's not the idea. So we go to another idea. Okay, no, it's going to be like this kind of woodstocky, woodsy little village with stained glass and, you know, Art Nouveau little cottagey things in the woods, and, you know, and then we thought, okay, well that's great if you're like a hippie. But that's not about animals. That's going all the way back to being about macrame and stained glass and granola, and that's not animal kingdom, so we need to go there. So then we have this, okay, it's going to be this gigantic cavernous grotto that's full of ferns, and it's like the beginning of the world, and you're going to go into this huge grotto, and you pop out on the other side, and you end up in the park. And in fact, the grotto concept is the final one that sort of, everybody looks at it and goes, all right. In my head, this is my sad job, I have to do this all the time. I have this little calculator in my head, and you go to somebody and go, okay, so the grotto concept, which is very appealing, very interesting idea. If you measure your grotto, you will realize that the grotto alone, just the grotto, represents about 400,000 square feet of rockwork, which is twice the size of Expedition Everest. So that's probably not actually the idea. Because that's like all the cement in Florida going into one thing, and we have the whole park to build. But there's something in this idea. We can use this idea and find our way to the spirit of a place that we can build that still is this rich, green, caverny kind of place that we go into on our way into the park, that calms us down, that changes the mood, that instantly establishes that this experience, this park, is about a different story. It's going to be a different kind of experience than any experience you've done before. And that's kind of how you finally get to one of these ideas. Same thing with the Tree of Life. This is one of the very first renderings of the Tree of Life. And if you look at the people wandering around the Tree of Life, you will see that it's much smaller than even the Tarzan treehouse. It's like a little tiny Tree of Life. This is another thing I do all the time, is I take my fingers and I measure people in other people's drawings. I'm like, okay, that person's 6 feet tall, right? That's a grown-up because there's a little kid next to them. So they're 6 feet tall. So if they're 6 feet tall and they're standing next to that tree's 40 feet tall. Well, there's $25,000 for that one tree. Okay. So, and that tree's 45 feet tall. That means that tree back there is 45 feet tall. And if that tree's 45 feet tall, then that means that that tower that you show behind that tree is 375 feet tall. And if it's really 375 feet tall, it's going to have a big red light on top. Is that what you meant? So it is worth looking at these renderings, because you really can see, look, I mean, the people are big, really big. And that means the tree is really small. And it wasn't even in the middle of the park. But we moved it to the middle of the park when we realized that this was the kind of symbol we wanted in the middle of the park. And then when we made the tree really big, we completely chickened out. And decided, okay, well, the tree is now so big that the only way we'll ever be able to hold it up is to build a giant geodesic dome. And then we'll like stick fake leaves on the outside of the geodesic dome. And it'll look very geometric, but kind of like a tree. And we spent a long time on this version of the tree, which had a restaurant on the bottom floor and a kind of a play environment all through the body of the tree, and this geodesic dome. And finally one day, very late, one of the engineers came and said, you know, now that we have designed the steel and the branches to hold up that geodesic dome, those branches would hold up anything. So we don't need the geodesic dome, because the tree is so strong now that we could just hold up the branches themselves. So, of course, it sounds really cool, but it's like a disaster because it's really late in the sequence. And we're like, okay, all right, if that's what you want to do, we got to do it. We got to do it quick. We got to make these changes. Got to come up with a new vision for the tree where, so we rapidly reconceptualized the tree to become the tree that you see today, and went through our design process. And that indeed became the tree of life that we built. And you guys have all seen the pictures with the giant steel thing that's inside of it.